Hi everybody, thank you for joining me once again as I continue to examine Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict from my atheist perspective. In this video we're going to cover 3 more chapters of the book, chapters 24, 25, and 26. So let's get started right away with chapter 24, Incongruities. And before we get too far into this, I just want to note at the end of the previous video in this series I said that this edition would probably be a lot shorter than they typically are in this series. That's not going to be the case. Even though the chapters, these 3 chapters, are relatively short in terms of page count, there's a lot in there to talk about. So this will actually be a normal length episode. So those of you who are looking forward to class letting out early, I humbly apologize. Anyway, in this first chapter we're going to look at chapter 24, Incongruities. McDowell addresses the fact that the Pentateuch, which was supposedly written by Moses, is written in the third person, and that it also contains an account of the death and burial of Moses. These are 2 oddities, we should say, of the Pentateuch, if we assume that it was written by Moses, that need to be accounted for or explained. So, first, let's look at the third person voice. If Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, as tradition says he did, why did he write in the third person about himself? Well, despite the documentary assumption that this indicates that someone other than Moses wrote the Pentateuch, McDowell proposes 2 plausible explanations that allow for the assumption of Mosaic authorship. First, Moses may have dictated his work to a scribe. In fact, according to McDowell and Roland Keith Harrison, whom McDowell quotes in support of this alternative, Moses may have dictated the various books he authored to many different scribes. Harris says, quote, "Quite possibly, many of the small or isolated sections in the Hebrew text were committed initially to the priests for safekeeping, and only at a later period were the manuscript pieces assembled into some sort of mosaic and joined together into a roll." Mosaic, I see what he did there. Very clever, Roland Keith Harrison. And again, that is from Roland Keith Harrison's book, Introduction to the Old Testament, quoted in this book by McDowell. So the first 5 books of the Old Testament that we have today, according to Harrison in that quote, were originally compiled from smaller manuscripts by people other than their original authors. You know, except for the insistence that Moses himself authored their contents, this is very close, in just a general sort of way, to how those who accept the documentary hypothesis believe that the Pentateuch was assembled. Pre-existing documents compiled into a larger single document. Also, is it just me, or does admitting the possible participation of scribes in the original writing of the Bible make the whole inerrant Word of God thing even harder to swallow? Remember, McDowell has said previously that he believes the original autographs of the Bible were perfect. They were totally without flaw, without contradiction. And the reason for this is that they were inspired by God. God saw to it through his divine revelation that the people writing those original manuscripts did it exactly the way he wanted. But now McDowell is at least allowing for the possibility that Moses didn't actually write those original autographs of the Pentateuch himself, but rather dictated them to scribes. So not only did God inspire Moses, who was the author of those books, he also must have inspired those scribes who took down the words dictated by Moses without making a single mistake. Now here's why I say this makes the inerrant Word of God bit even more difficult to swallow. If God supernaturally prevented the scribes who were writing down the words dictated by the original author from making any mistakes, why didn't he do the same thing for the next generation of scribes that were copying off of those original manuscripts? Or the scribes who wrote the next generation of copies after that? And so on, down the generations to today. Because McDowell admits that the copies of the Bible we have today are not inerrant. They contain errors. Now, he hides behind the non-existent original autographs and says that they were truly the perfect versions, and the few mistakes that we have in our current modern Bibles are just the result of copyists' errors and things like that. But he admits that the copyists at some point through the line made a mistake, so they must not have been inspired by God. But the original copyists, the original scribes who wrote down what Moses was saying, if indeed we are to accept that it was dictated, well, they must have been inspired because they didn't make any mistakes. They produced a perfect original autograph. So God inspired Moses, the original author, to dictate a perfect document, and he inspired the scribes who took Moses' dictation to write that perfect document. And then God just, stopped paying attention? It was important that he transmit his word into writing in an inerrant form, but just that one time, just for that one original document that almost no one would ever actually read, and it wouldn't have taken omniscience for God to realize that. If God wanted to transmit his perfect inerrant word in writing to humanity, and he did, according to McDowell and to millions of other Christians, why did he only inspire the original authors and the scribes that worked directly with them to produce error-free texts? Because here's the thing. God is omnipotent. Everything he does is effortless. Nothing he does exhausts him or requires the slightest bit of effort. He could have seen to it that every copy made from those perfect originals was equally perfect, that every translation from the original language was flawless, preserving his words and his message exactly as intended, with perfect clarity. For that matter, he could also have protected those original autographs, kept them from being lost to history so that they would be around to use as a point of comparison to prove that the latest copies are 100% perfect, exact duplicates of the originals. God could have done all of that and done it just as easily as he inspired the original authors and their scribes, because God can do anything. But he didn't. And if that does nothing to arouse your suspicion, if that doesn't cause you to doubt the likelihood of God's role in the creation of these books just a little bit, then you are too credulous for decent company. The other alternative to why the Pentateuch was written by Moses in the third person is that Moses didn't rely on scribes to take dictation. He simply just sat down himself and wrote it in third person for some reason. McDowell points out that other writers from antiquity have also written about themselves in third person. One of the examples he cites is Julius Caesar. And that's fine. I mean, it takes a bit of the edge off of what I was just talking about, although it still doesn't make sense to me that God would inspire the originals to be perfect and then say, fuck it, who cares about the countless copies produced from those originals, and knowing that it would be overwhelmingly the copies that people would read and take as his word. Why would he not want to ensure that those were just as perfect as the originals? I would also note that an author writing a work of supposed nonfiction about his own life in the third person would be just as odd whether it were dictated or written personally, because even if Moses was giving dictation, he would still have been dictating a third-person narrative, one would assume, unless in the time between the words leaving Moses' mouth and being written down by the scribes, God decided that he wanted his word to be written in third person instead of first person, and he inspired the scribes to change the perspective on the fly. I mean, really, who knows what went on in the writing process of the Old Testament? Even if we assume, as I suspect McDowell would like us to, that Moses wrote the Pentateuch personally with his own hand without the use of scribes in the third person, Mosaic authorship is still a pretty implausible proposition. The evidence for the documentary hypothesis is so broad and diverse that it can afford to discard a relatively minor line of evidence like the third person voice and still remain standing strong. If not specifically the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, then something very much like it, explaining the Pentateuch as the work of multiple authors whose work was compiled later by others. In fact, I'm pretty sure that it wasn't the voice, it wasn't the perspective that first, made the light go on in the original creators of the documentary hypothesis. It was the names of God and the different writing styles evident in the Pentateuch. The third person voice, as I say, is a little odd, but it's not really the smoking gun that makes you think, hey, I don't think Moses wrote this. Moses could have just been a pretentious weirdo. Now, before we leave this chapter, let's return to the problem of Moses writing about his own death and burial, because McDowell returns to this problem, and he actually solves it real quick-like. Get a load of this. Quote, "The account of Moses' death was a later addition." Well, okay, well, what are we talking about then? The thing is, it's not quite that simple. McDowell goes on to inform us that it is a Jewish tradition found in the Talmud to attribute the final chapter of Deuteronomy, which is that account of the death of Moses, to Joshua. And we should look at it like Moses' obituary that was added by Joshua, his successor, to the end of the Pentateuch, Moses' great work. Well, I want to get into this in some more detail, because I think this is an interesting point to kind of dig into. But before I do, isn't it interesting how willing McDowell is to accept the Jewish view when it doesn't conflict with his Christian view? He cites the Talmud and the Jewish tradition attributing that final portion of Deuteronomy to Joshua as though that Jewish version is an authority. So, well, look, that's what the Jews think. So they got that bit right, but they got Isaiah 53 completely wrong. Apparently. Isaiah 53, which they insist is not a messianic prophecy, and McDowell and many evangelical Christians insist clearly is a prophecy about the coming of Jesus. The Jews got that completely wrong, but they know who wrote the tacked-on ending to Deuteronomy at least. So, you know, that's something. At least they're not complete idiots, those Jews. Now then, McDowell says that all of Deuteronomy was written by the same author, Moses, except for that final chapter, which was written and added on after the death of Moses by Joshua. So let's take a look at that final chapter. That's chapter 34 of the book of Deuteronomy, and let's see what it actually says. And as always, I will be reading from the King James. So this is the final chapter, chapter 34 of the book of Deuteronomy. Quote, "And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, and that is over against Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead, unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah, unto the utmost sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, unto Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day." Okay, now, I'm not a linguist, but I would buy that I just read to you was written by a single author. The sentence structure seems consistent. Nothing sticks out as obviously wrong, and it reads like a nice, definitive, sort of poetic ending to the book and to the life of Moses. Moses dies, God buries him, and to this day, no one knows where. It's a perfectly respectable end of a myth, of a folk tale, which is essentially what I believe the story of Moses and the first 5 books of the Bible is. But the thing is, that's not the end. Deuteronomy 34 continues, quote, "And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses." Okay, seems like a little bit of an afterthought, like the writer was going, oh, I forgot to tell you something else. Reads a bit like it was tacked on to the end of what I just previously read, but it makes sense, especially if we're assuming that Joshua did actually write it, since he makes sure to put himself over real good there, writing that he's full of the spirit of wisdom and he was Moses' rightful successor. Okay, good on you, Joshua. A little self-promotion never hurt anybody. But that's still not the end of Deuteronomy 34. It goes on, quote, "And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and in all that mighty hand, and in all the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel." And that, finally, is the end of Deuteronomy 34 and the end of the entire book of Deuteronomy and the end of the Pentateuch. Again, it seems like things have been brought to a conclusion, only to be started up again. The end of that previous section that I read, where Joshua takes over, and Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him and did as the Lord commanded. Okay, the baton has been handed over. Moses is dead. Joshua has taken over. The end, right? Nope. "And there arose not a prophet since in Israel." It starts up all over again. And this suggests to me that either this chapter was written by one person who was just a shitty writer who couldn't make up his mind what to do for an ending, or that each of these three separate endings were written separately, independently, and were combined after the fact. And according to the documentary hypothesis, this is precisely what happened. Those last three verses were written by the Deuteronomist, or the D source, and they were probably the original ending of the book of Deuteronomy. And D was also the author of most of the book of Deuteronomy, almost all of the book of Deuteronomy, as you might have expected from the name, the Deuteronomist. Most of Deuteronomy was written, according to the documentary hypothesis, by the Deuteronomist, and then beginning about halfway through chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, we see material from another author, which is the Elohist, or the E-source, start to appear. And it was the E-source who wrote the first portion of chapter 34 that I read, the first 6 verses. And then also in the book of Deuteronomy, we find text that was probably written by the priestly source, or the P source. And it was the P source who wrote that middle portion of the ending. And I think if you read Deuteronomy 34 with an open mind, without any presuppositions, it seems plausible and even probable that it was written by more than one author. The winding down and winding back up character of it is suggestive of this, even if nothing else is. The claim that this final chapter was written by one author and that that author was Joshua strikes me as a less plausible claim. So moving on to chapter 25, Internal Diversity. In this chapter, McDowell deals with the diversity in the Pentateuch and argues that despite the changes in style and diction and subject matter throughout the 5 books, Moses was the sole author. McDowell considers 3 areas where the Pentateuch exhibits this diversity, and these 3 areas are subject matter, style, and diction. He dismisses the suggestion that the diversity of subject matter indicates multiple authors, since other ancient writers were able to write fluently about many different subjects and in many different forms. And one of McDowell's quoted experts specifically cites the example of the ancient Egyptian writer Kati. Well, it seems a little simplistic to me, but McDowell is obviously looking for any excuse that allows him to maintain his presupposition that the Bible is divinely inspired. So okay, maybe Moses was a man of diverse interests, capable of writing articulately about many subjects. I'll give you that one. Or maybe he was just writing what God told him to write. And it seems to me that if McDowell really believes that, and he considers that a reasonable, respectful belief, that he should just default to that. Whenever there's a question about, well, how could Moses write this? Why doesn't McDowell just say, well, it was revealed to him by God? I mean, that is a completely logical, respectable thing that an intelligent person in the 21st century could believe. Right, Josh? Why should we believe Moses was capable of writing about all those different subjects? Why? Because God was revealing it all to him. I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the video. Moving on to style. McDowell cites an interesting example, I think, to support his argument that a diversity of styles in the Pentateuch doesn't necessarily imply multiple authors. Quote, Dante's Divine Comedy provides a helpful example of a work that has only one author but divergent styles in presenting God's nature. Many passages colorfully depict the intervention of God into human affairs, while immediately beside them are passages rich in systematic doctrine. Yet here we have one author and one document, no more. Well, for one thing, we know that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy. We have a much more certain provenance of that work than we have of the Pentateuch. So there's not really a comparison there. We don't really need a documentary hypothesis to explain where the Divine Comedy came from. We pretty much have a good idea. For another, Dante was openly writing a creative poetic work. He wasn't presenting it as a literal history or as the inspired word of God. And finally, and most obviously, Dante's characterization of God is based on the Bible. Pointing out that Dante was capable of depicting God in a variety of ways suggests nothing about the authorship of the Pentateuch. Yes, Dante was able to do it, yes, very easily, because he took the example of the Bible. He was writing about the God of the Bible, which contains those many diverse characterizations. It's absolutely a meaningless observation. The last area of diversity considered is diction. McDowell admits that there are noticeable variations in vocabulary throughout the Pentateuch, but he insists that this doesn't imply multiple sources, because how could he not? Quote, while it is readily admitted that there is considerable variation of vocabulary in the Pentateuch, the evidence for the existence of unique diction in each source is the result of the critics' circular reasoning. They compile a list of all the passages that contain certain words, labeling these passages as being from a particular source, and then announce that since these words do not appear anywhere else in the text, outside the source, they are in fact characteristic of that source only. Thus, the phenomenon is created by the hypothesis itself. Except, not really. There isn't anything circular about observing that certain passages of the text appear to be written in one idiom and certain other passages appear to be written in another. Chapter 26, Conclusion to the Documentary Hypothesis. How sweet it is. McDowell addresses some of the strengths of the documentary hypothesis and then attempts to show why these are not really strengths. First, the collective force of the hypothesis. Even though no single criterion of the documentary hypothesis is sufficient to make the documentary hypothesis convincing, when taken collectively, they present a very strong argument. This is what documentarians would say. McDowell says, not true, he rejects that, and he claims that a series of invalid criteria possesses no force. But of course, McDowell hasn't shown that the individual criteria of the documentary hypothesis are invalid. At most, even if we grant him his various arguments made in these recent chapters, he's only shown that each individual criteria is insufficient on its own. But this is the point of considering them collectively. By itself, the varying use of divine names might not be enough to assume multiple authors. By itself, the changes in the character of God might not be enough to assume multiple authors. By itself, the changes in vocabulary and style might not be enough to assume multiple authors. But all of those things, which McDowell doesn't deny are present in the text, along with the other features elucidated by documentarians, considered collectively, are sufficient to conclude that the Pentateuch was written by multiple authors, at least in the judgment of many Bible scholars, nearly all of whom, I remind you again, are Christians. So, what's with the widespread acceptance of the documentary hypothesis, which McDowell also acknowledges, while continuing to refer to those who hold to it as radical critics because he doesn't know what words mean? Well, McDowell says this about that widespread acceptance. Quote, Why, it may be asked, if the documentary hypothesis is as invalid as this investigation has attempted to show, was it so eagerly received and defended in most scholarly circles throughout continental Europe, Great Britain, and the United States? That awkward moment where you accidentally ask a question that answers itself. So what are some of the fatal methodological weaknesses of this documentary hypothesis, according to Josh McDowell? Well, he describes 5 examples of these fatal methodological weaknesses of the documentary hypothesis. First, the imposition of a modern Occidental view on ancient Oriental literature. He really dug into the dictionary for that one, didn't he? Here McDowell takes issue with the practice of using the vocabulary and the form of a document to date it. This isn't fair, he says, because there are no other surviving examples of ancient Hebrew literature to compare with the Pentateuch, and because the scholars attempting to date the documents in this way are foreigners to both the time and the culture in which the documents were produced. McDowell's solution to this dilemma of being a foreigner to the culture that produced the Pentateuch is, of course, to uncritically accept everything it says as the absolute truth. I think I'll lean more toward the documentarians there. Next, the lack of objective evidence. I love this one. McDowell says, quote, "Even the most dogmatic documentarian must admit that there is no objective evidence for the existence or the history of the J, E, or any of the documents alleged to make up the Torah. There is no manuscript of any portion of the Old Testament dating from earlier than the 3rd century BC. That's right, Josh. So when documentarians refer to sources that they presume must have existed at some point as a result of their textual analysis, that's methodological weakness. But not when literalists like McDowell appeal to the non-existent original autographs to argue for biblical inerrancy. That's fine. That's completely cool. It's that other thing that the scholars do. No. Can't do that. Next, substitution of disintegrative approach for harmonistic approach. McDowell insists that the harmonistic approach is the only valid way of approaching the Bible. That is, the assumption that apparent contradictions in the text aren't actually contradictions, that there are solutions whether we have found those solutions or not. McDowell argues that if you look for contradictions in any text as diverse as the Bible, you will certainly find them. Well, we've gone over this before. It's not that we go in looking for contradictions when we read the Bible critically. It's that we recognize contradictions as such when we find them. And we don't continue to insist that there are no contradictions when contradictions stare us in the face. Are there some apparent contradictions in the Bible that can be resolved? Well, sure. And I mentioned some of them in previous episodes of this series. For instance, the different names for the mountain on which Moses received the 10 Commandments. Some passages refer to it as Sinai, some refer to it as Horeb. And they could just be 2 names given to the same location. That happens sometimes. Okay, fair enough. But not all contradictions can be resolved like that. And McDowell knows this and admits this, which is why he has reminded us in previous chapters that it's only the original autographs of the Bible that are truly inerrant, truly without contradiction. So if we follow his methodology, when we find a contradiction in the Bible that cannot be resolved in any other way by studying the text further, we should assume that this is a copyist's error and that the original autograph, which no longer exists and hasn't been seen by anyone for thousands of years, doesn't contain this contradiction and is perfect. And McDowell repeatedly claims that the harmonistic approach is the way that all ancient documents are evaluated. But the approach that he's advocating for evaluating the Bible goes far beyond harmonistic. He's not saying don't just assume a perceived difficulty in the text is unresolvable until you've checked it out further and made sure. No. He's saying don't ever accept any perceived difficulties, no matter how unresolvable. Appeal to non-existent sources and blame the difficulties on the scribes if you have to, but don't ever accept that there are real unresolvable difficulties in the text, because the text has to be perfect. He has a presupposition that the Bible is perfect, and he refuses to accept any evidence to the contrary. And this is emphatically not the way that other ancient documents are evaluated. Next, the number of original documents is unlimited. McDowell claims that as the documentary hypothesis gained acceptance, and then different scholars sort of went off in their own directions and tried to refine it and come up with their own versions that they felt worked better than the traditional Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, the number of sources has increased, and the J and the E and the D and the P of the traditional Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis have been joined by other sources like J2, L, K, S, and many others, depending on what theory you're talking about. And since there are no controls on how many sources might be identified, consistent analysis of the text is impossible. Well, there are more recent theories based on Graf-Wellhausen, or at least based on the insights of Graf-Wellhausen, the idea, the concept of the multiple documents being compiled, that do identify more sources than the J and the E and the D and the P that are most familiar. But there are also theories that identify fewer than these four classic sources. There are theories that have J, E, and D playing the most prominent roles, with P contributing relatively little. There are theories that include significant contributions from redactors and some that require minimal redactor activity to work. There is, in other words, a lot of disagreement among people who hold various versions of the documentary hypothesis. These so-called radical critics, who account for the vast majority of biblical scholars, on the specifics of how many sources there are and what passages were written by which sources, and so on and so on. But one thing the overwhelming majority of those modern Bible scholars agrees on is that the Pentateuch was written by multiple authors, and that none of those authors was Moses. Next is irresponsible logic. McDowell accuses the documentarians of arguing in a circle, building their preferred conclusions into the premises of their theory. And he presents us with two examples of this. He projects in two directions. First, the formulation of the J, E, D, and P sources. McDowell claims that the characteristics of the four documents were predetermined, and then passages were assigned to each source according to how their characteristics matched those of these predetermined sources. McDowell is either lying or honestly ignorant about how the sources were differentiated. Either way, he's got it backwards. He makes it sound as if, let's just say, Julius Wellhausen was sitting back smoking a pipe one day when he decided, out of the blue, that there would be four original sources for the Pentateuch. That one of these would feature an interactive personal God, and another would feature an aloof transcendent God, and one would be interested in emphasizing the covenant between God and Israel, and another would be interested in religious ritual. Like, Wellhausen just sort of thought these different sources up. Well, Wellhausen didn't arbitrarily define the sources and then just divide the text up accordingly. He read the text with his critical scholar's eye, and he recognized that there seemed to be multiple voices speaking to him from that text, and that at times it was obvious when the handoff from one voice to another had taken place. And I, of course, would cite the two creation stories from Genesis that we went over in the previous video in this series as an example of an instance where this transition from one voice or one source to another is so obvious as to be unmistakable. And that is the fundamental insight from which the documentary hypothesis, in all its various modern iterations, was born. That there appear to be multiple voices speaking in the Pentateuch. That these texts that are given to us as a whole were originally written by different people, and that this is evident just by reading the text and seeing the different voices, the different styles that are to be found there. that, again, McDowell does not deny are there. Well, Wellhausen thought that there were 4 voices or 4 original documents primarily. Others thought that there were 3. Some thought there were 5 or 6 or even more. A lot of these disagreements are over very subtle distinctions. There are sections where there is very, very broad agreement. For instance, it's agreed by the vast majority of scholars that most of Deuteronomy, in fact, almost all of Deuteronomy, was written by a single author, by the D source. But there is still some disagreement. And it all starts from the text. It doesn't start from presuppositions or from arbitrarily defined sources with arbitrarily chosen characteristics. It starts from the text. And whether McDowell agrees with it or not, he can't just argue that the documentary hypothesis is something that is being imposed on the text from the outside. It's exactly the opposite. It's an interpretation derived from the text itself. McDowell is free to disagree with it, obviously he does, but to claim that it's the result of a presupposition or a circular argument is just wrong, and again is yet another example of an obvious projection by McDowell of his point of view and his methods onto those of his opponent. The other example of irresponsible logic McDowell describes is the dependence on redactors of formulators of documentary hypothesis. By relying on redactors, who are responsible for compiling the documents and also may have been responsible for adding certain passages, McDowell says the documentarians have essentially admitted that their theory doesn't work. Every appeal to the redactor is a tacit admission that the theory breaks down at that point. And I would actually tend to agree with McDowell on the principle that over-reliance on redactors indicates a weaker theory, at least when compared to a theory that doesn't require as much work from the redactors to make it work. If Graf Wellhausen or any other version of the documentary hypothesis was attributing lengthy sections of the text to an unknown redactor, that might be a problem. But if you look at how the text of the Pentateuch breaks down into the individual sources, according to the Graf Wellhausen hypothesis, and we'll just use that as an example because, again, throughout history it has been the most broadly accepted version, and it is the foundation for most of the newer versions. If you look at how the Pentateuch breaks down into the sources according to that theory, you see that over-reliance on redactors isn't really that much of an issue. And there's a very easy way for you to do this, even if you, like me, have almost no expertise or skill or knowledge in the documentary hypothesis or linguistics or textual analysis, etc. There's a really easy way for you to do this. In the description box of this video, I have placed a link to an online copy of the King James translation of the Pentateuch that is color-coded according to the Graf Wellhausen version of the documentary hypothesis. Someone contributed to Wikiversity. They were kind enough to put this out for all the world to use it as a study tool. The redaction sources in this version of the Pentateuch are printed mostly in red. There are some other colors that are assigned here and there to the redactors, and there's a key on every page so you can keep it straight, but mostly they're in red. If you scroll through each of the 5 books and you compare how much red text there is to the text of other colors indicating the other sources, you won't see a hell of a lot of red. There will be some, and there are a few long passages, especially in Genesis and Exodus, that are attributed to redaction sources, but far, far less than is attributed to J, E, D, or P. And the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy have almost no redaction content. And actually, I counted. Leviticus has 14 verses attributed to a redactor, and Deuteronomy has 5. So to me, this is not a mortal wound. The amount of material attributed to the redactor by Graf Wellhausen is relatively small, but it's still there. So what about it? Despite the much more significant contributions of the main sources, there are occasionally, as I said, some long passages attributed to redaction sources. Is that not an admission from the documentarians that they can't account for those passages? that they don't seem to fit with one of the established sources, so they're just chalked up to a redactor. Well, what if that is the case? One thing fundamentalists like McDowell consistently misunderstand about science, and if textual criticism is not quite a science, it at least makes use of the scientific method in its investigations, is that a scientific theory doesn't have to explain every single aspect of a phenomenon in order to be sound and to be useful. Creationists exaggerate the significance of the so-called holes in the theory of evolution, seizing on the bits of biology that it can't explain yet, or over which there is still some disagreement in the scientific community, and they declare it invalid or a theory in crisis. And similar pronouncements are made about the Big Bang Theory. But the questions a theory can't answer don't negate the ones that it does plausibly answer. And like the theories of evolution and the Big Bang, the documentary hypothesis provides plausible, useful answers to questions about where the Pentateuch came from. More plausible than Moses did it, and certainly more useful than God did it, which is the most useless explanation you could ever give for anything. Well, that wraps it up for McDowell's attempt to refute the documentary hypothesis, and in the next video we'll finish up with this section of the book as McDowell turns to the New Testament and takes on form criticism. But before I wrap things up in this video, I wanted to point out something, and it's something that some of you may have noticed for yourselves, but I really want to underline it because I think it's important, and it's an example of what I believe to be the fundamentally dishonest method by which Josh McDowell operates in this book. I mentioned it briefly earlier in this video. For most of these last several chapters about the documentary hypothesis, the origin of the Pentateuch, McDowell has defended Mosaic authorship, and he's done this by defending the credentials of Moses, by insisting that Moses was not only a real person, but that he had the education and the experience and the cultural familiarity to write these first 5 books of the Old Testament as we have them. And he's also argued that Moses would have been fully capable of writing articulately about the various subjects addressed in those 5 books and in the various styles that we find, using the various forms and vocabularies, all of which McDowell acknowledges are present in the text. In other words, McDowell argues for Mosaic authorship as if Moses wrote the Pentateuch all by himself. But that's not what Josh McDowell actually believes. According to Josh McDowell, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch all by himself. He was inspired by God to write the Pentateuch. There aren't just 5 books written by a talented and highly educated author with a diverse life experience. No. Those 5 books are the inerrant word of God. That's what Josh McDowell believes. He doesn't just dismiss the documentary hypothesis or the more general position that the Bible, however it was written, was not divinely inspired. He addresses the various premises upon which the documentary hypothesis is based, and he attempts to invalidate them by arguing against multiple authors and for Moses as the single author. And the reasons he gives might sound good to a Christian looking for an excuse to reject the naturalistic explanation of where his scripture came from, but the entire line of argumentation is disingenuous. Josh McDowell doesn't believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. He believes God wrote the Pentateuch, and Moses was essentially his secretary. All that stuff about the qualifications of Moses and the plausibility of one author writing in different styles, etc., is artifice. It's ornamentation designed to make McDowell's position look a lot more impressive and well-founded than it is. It's elaborate, but it is ultimately useless. And McDowell switches back and forth between God wrote the Bible and Moses wrote the Bible without notice, whenever it suits him, just as William Lane Craig jumps back and forth between arguments for a generic deistic prime mover God and arguments for the specific God of the Bible, while pretending that they're the same thing. It's a deception meant to disguise a simple religious argument as a sophisticated philosophical or scientific argument. Of course, it ultimately fails because McDowell is an apologist, and like William Lane Craig, he sucks at philosophy and science. So, that is it for this video. That is it for chapters 24, 25, and 26. In the next video, we will conclude this section of the book, which has been part 3, the case for and against Christianity, by looking at the final 5 chapters of this part of the evidence that demands a verdict. Chapter 27, Introduction to New Testament Form Criticism. Chapter 28, Historical Skepticism. Chapter 29, Jesus Under Fire. Wouldn't that be a great movie? Chapter 30, Conclusion to Form Criticism. And then Chapter 31, Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, which is a chapter written by C.S. Lewis. He's bringing in a ringer. Wasn't this book thick enough? Did Josh think, I need an extra chapter in here, I'm going to just throw in some fucking C.S. Lewis? Apparently he did. So we'll take a look at all 5 of those chapters, 4 from McDowell, and then probably what will end up being a welcome return visit from C.S. Lewis, who, of all the Christian writers and apologists I have dealt with in these various series, at least knows how to fucking write. He is alone in that condition, but at least the guy can write, unlike this guy. So, that's it for this time. I will see you next time. Thank you guys so much for watching, for being interested in this. I'm glad that this is of use to you. Please feel free to leave comments about anything I've said. Engage me, argue with me, agree with me, whatever you feel like doing. I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.